Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 1, Amelia Dates. I followed my grandmother into her kitchen to learn and really to witness her famous Christmas pudding, which is really just pan drippings, rendered fat, flour, baking powder, salt, pepper, and an egg to hold it all together. She said that the best seasoning in the world came from the fat and the drippings and not the seasonings that you add. It had been a year since my grandfather had died, and it was clear that she missed him. Someday she didn't want to talk. Today, while she was trying to teach me to cook, she did. I asked about Grandpa and how he got into her good graces after he picked up the kids. She asked me, "Why are you interested in this stuff?" I told her the truth, because it's your life, your loves, and how this house came to be. She accidentally dropped a pen at that point, and I picked it up and handed it to her. My grandmother was trying to teach me to cook from memory, not from recipes. Her recipes were just a list of ingredients, not a measurement of things. She said that you gotta taste it as she dipped a spoon into the mixture, and then remember that taste, and then you gotta cook to that taste. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 2, Amelia Dates. As promised, Phil was waiting for Joni and Richard when they got out of school. As they started walking together, Amelia showed up out of breath. Joni was surprised by her mother showing up. "Mama, what are you doing here?" Amelia explained that she didn't have to go to work so early, which was a lie. "I do have to go serve dinner later, so I thought I'd meet you before I went in." They all started walking together with Joni and Richard peppering Phil with questions about his ship, why he got out, what were his plans, and where was he going to live now. Phil answered, "Well, unfortunately, it's sunk, Richard. The Navy let me go, and I haven't quite figured those things out yet, Missy Joni." They reached the front door of the house, and Joni piped in with the obvious question, "Mama, can Mr. Harris have dinner with us?" Amelia was ready for it. "I think Mr. Harris has other things to do, right?" glaring at him as the words came out of her mouth. Phil smiled. "Nope, got nothing better to do. I'd love to have dinner with you, Missy Joni and Richard. I'll even cook," said Phil. Amelia just rolled her eyes. She was never going to get rid of this man now. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 3, Amelia Dates. Amelia needed to get back to work. She knew Mr. Harris was a good man in his heart, and Joni seemed to trust him. So she made the tactical decision she'd leave them with Mr. Harris. She pulled him aside once they were in the door. "I'm going to call you every hour on the hour to check in." Phil nodded while Joni was coming to get him. Amelia continued, "I'll be home by 9 at the latest. Please make sure their homework is all done and they can listen to an hour of radio before they all go to bed." Phil nodded. Joni asked if she could stay up and say goodnight, and Amelia said no. Phil redirected, "Let's see what you've got in the icebox, Missy Joni," and rushed her into the kitchen. Amelia picked up her purse, adjusted her hat, and wished them all goodbye. The last thing she heard was her son's voice saying, "I hate Brussels sprouts." She moved quickly to catch the bus and arrived just as the roast was coming out of the oven. She served, cleared, cleaned, and called every hour on the hour, as she said. Phil answered the hall phone, making certain to let Joni and Richard speak to their mom every time. My grandfather later said to me, "I had a plan." Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 4, Amelia Dates. While Amelia was at work, Phil noted a few things that weren't working in her apartment. Her bath and toilet ran a little, her tub leaked a lot, and her kitchen faucet was a waterworks show. He asked Joni if her mother had any tools, and she did, so he set to work. After, he made them a fine dinner of spicy Spanish rice, cooked beans, collard greens, tomatoes, and a little leftover meat that he fried up. Joni loved it, and Richard hated the collard greens, but ate up everything else. While the kids were doing their homework and had stopped peppering him with questions, Phil got to work. He started with the toilet first, and closed the seal with a little chewing gum. Then he closed up the leak in the tub with some mortar that he made from sand in the backyard and hard grease from dinner. It wouldn't last long, but it would plug up the leak long enough till she could get it properly repaired. Then he set his sights on the kitchen sink. He was under the sink, twisting things tight, when he heard the front door unlock. He was just getting from under the sink when Amelia appeared in front of him. She looked tired, but beautiful, he told me. I asked him, "What did she say when she saw that you were repairing things?" Just then my grandmother yelled from her bed, "Phil, don't you tell that boy no lies!" Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 5, Amelia Dates. Your grandmother did not look pleased, my grandfather said to me, his stogie smoke filling the air. "Mr. Harris, what are you doing?" she asked in a very rough tone. "Fixing your faucet. It seems to have become a shower," answered Phil. "Oh, so now you're a plumber?" "Phil Harris, veteran cook, babysitter, and plumber?" she asked. "No, ma'am. Cook, babysitter, damage control specialist. I just do plumbing on the side," Phil said with a straight face. Before the war, he was actually an apprentice plumber. However, when the war started, he realized that he'd forever be fixing some toilet somewhere. So when he enlisted, he neglected to mention the whole plumbing business. Oops. Your grandmother didn't believe me, so I had her turn on the water. "Okay, Mr. Harris, let's try this." She turned on the water, and it didn't leak. She was surprised, stunned. For the first time since she moved in, notes to the super, trying to do it herself, not to mention all the men that she dated, 2 of which were plumbers, and not one had done what Mr. Harris had done in a single evening. Maybe he wasn't so bad to have around. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 6, Amelia Dates. Phil showed her the rest of his fixes. The tub, the toilet. It was clear she was impressed. He told me that was partly the reason why he did it, to impress her. The other was because he could, and he'd been stuck in a transport for the last 5 months. And he was itching to do something with his hands. My grandfather was one of those men that needed to do something every day. An honest day's work for an honest day's pay. Banker's hours just didn't appeal to him. He got up with the sun, made his own meals, worked till the sun went down, and then made his own dinner. He was like that even on the ship. His shipmates thought he was bucking for promotion, and that was the last thing he wanted. Mrs. Bolde, from what I could see, things needed fixing. I probably should have asked first, but I figured from what Missy Joni said, you'd probably be happy with the results. So what did she say, Grandpa? I asked. Before he could answer, Phillip Harris, are you telling that plumbing story again? My grandmother yelled from the other room. My grandfather just winked. She knew she was listening. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 7, Amelia Dates. With all her plumbing fixed and Phil in Amelia's good graces, my grandfather was a happy man. My grandmother, on the other hand, was worried. Worried because she was now indebted to him. My grandmother was one of those people that didn't like to owe anybody for anything. She always paid cash for everything. Credit was never an option for her. Thank you for doing that, Mr. Harris. I appreciate it. I can't pay you much for your service, but I can pay you, said Amelia. Phil just waved her off. Not necessary, Mrs. Bolde, replied Phil. My grandmother stammered a little. So what can I do to repay you? The moment it was out of her mouth, she regretted it. I remember her saying that to me. To his credit, Phil smiled and replied, nothing. It was my pleasure. Your children were payment enough, which was the truth. Phil turned to get his things. He needed to catch the bus to get back to the base to bunk up for the night. Amelia thanked him again and showed him to the door. And that's when my grandfather had an idea. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 8, Amelia Dates. Standing in the doorway, Phil started. Mrs. Bolde, I'm happy to babysit for you at any time. And as I understand it from Missy Joni, you have a date tomorrow, and your sister is sick. Amelia was in shock. A, her daughter was talking about her private business, and B, Phil wanted to babysit while she went out on a date with another man. What was he on? Yes, I do have a date, and yes, Wait a second. What did my daughter tell you? Nothing, he said, just that, and she liked my cooking, and I was the best babysitter. And that's when Amelia and Phil heard from Joni's room, it's true, Mama, Mr. Harris is the best. My grandmother told me that she was going to cancel that date. I asked her, was it because your sister was sick? And she said, no, he was a nice man, but he wasn't, doing it for me. And she looked at me with a twinkle, and I said, Grandma! She said, what? You're old enough to understand these things. But as she put it, now she had to go to throw Mr. Harris off on the scent. Fine, be here tomorrow night, she said, at 5:30. Phil smiled and then walked out the door. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 9, Amelia Dates. Your grandfather looked rather sharp when he showed up the next day, dressed all in his navy whites, my grandmother said. We were still in the kitchen with me making gravy for the roast, like she showed me, and now she had me frying up onions that I spent the last hour cutting. What'd you say to him when he came to the door? I asked in between the onion tears. Well, she started, I told him that he cleaned up nice, and he had shaved and showered and shined, and that he looked all spit and polished for my date with another man. Grandma, you didn't actually say that. She replied, you bet your bippy I did. I said, let me get this straight. You actually went out on a date with another man that you weren't interested in while Grandpa babysat your kids from your first husband just to throw him off the scent. She looked at me with a straight face and said, yep. I tried to ask the obvious question. You didn't, She knew exactly what I was going to ask. No, and a lady never tells. But he sure was a real nice looker, and boy, did he know how to kiss. Grandma! My grandmother was a real card. Amelia Stories, Chapter 3, Section 10, Amelia Dates. He came to my rescue, she said matter-of-factly. What? Wait, how? I asked impatiently. When I got to my front door, she started, my date decided he wanted payment for dinner and got a little handsy. I mean, I kissed him goodnight and all, but he wanted more, and I said no, and that's when I guess your grandfather heard the commotion and then stepped in. I was rapt with attention at this point because I'd never heard this. She continued. He stepped up behind the guy, took hold of his collar, and said something like, I think the lady said no, bud, and then bum-rushed him right out my front door. My grandfather was no weakling. He had muscle, and heft to him, you did not want to cross him. She went on. He really threw him hard out the door, so hard he actually hit my hall neighbor's door. Jesus, Grandma! So basically, Grandpa saved you from getting raped right then, right? She was stirring my gravy concoction, tasting it, and then replied, need something. She selectively decided not to hear me. So is that when you decided that Grandpa was okay, I asked? My grandmother added a bit more pepper and then replied, nope.